Okay, thanks all for joining today at this web demonstration of Waterworld and Costing Nature tools. So the tools that I'll be talking about today are tools that can be used to map ecosystem services in support of management and policy. These tools have been developed here at King's College London. So as I said, I will first give a short presentation on a little bit on the background of these tools, why they were developed, and how they compare to other tools out there as well. And then I will give a demonstration of Costing Nature first, and then Waterworld as well. So the aims of this presentation are to summarize the landscape of map-based ecosystem service and water risk tools, so what kind of tools are out there, to introduce the scientific principles behind the two tools, and also to outline operating principles of the tools. So on this slide, you can see we have done a little comparison between Waterworld and Costing Nature with some tools that we know of that are out there, Aries and Invest. So if we look at these tools in terms of baseline services, we can see that they pretty much do very similar things in terms of baseline services. So all three of these tools can model water quantity, do water quality, water regulation, at least for Aries and Waterworld Costing Nature. Carbon, all three tools do that as well. Hazard mitigation, not in Aries. But then if we look at how you can implement scenarios in these tools, we see that there's quite a difference in that climate change, land use change, those kind of interventions can be very easily modeled in Waterworld and Costing Nature, but are not as of yet part of tools like Aries or Invest. In Invest, you can do these scenarios, but you will have to supply the data yourself. In terms of spatial resolution, Waterworld and Costing Nature run on a very similar database, and the database is globally applicable, but the resolution is fixed to either 1 hectare or 1 square kilometer. In terms of temporal resolution, it runs monthly for Waterworld, but all data is supplied, and that is the main difference between the tools that I'm presenting to you today and other tools that are out there, is that we provide these tools with all the data included. Which means, if we look at the time to complete an analysis, that in Waterworld and Costing Nature, and you will see that later, you can run a simulation in 15 minutes or less, whereas to do a full analysis in any of these other tools mentioned here, you will need a lot more time. And so that's not because these tools take so long to run, it's because it takes so long to prepare data yourself, find data, pre-process it, enter it into the tools, etc. So in terms of software, our tools are web-based, so you won't need to download anything. That means that we can update the tools whenever we want to. We can fix bugs and things like that. And it makes it easy for you to access them. Whereas for some other tools like Invest, you will need to download the tool. For Invest, you either need ArcGIS and extensions, which is expensive software, although more recently there is a standalone version available. In terms of expertise required, for Invest, you definitely need a lot of expertise because you need to do all the data processing. For Waterworld Costing Nature, you don't, although it might be useful in terms of interpreting results. But anyone should be able to run a baseline. In terms of development, we're currently in version 2 with Waterworld and Costing Nature. Aries is, as far as we know, not released yet. By the way, all this data is or some of this data is based on a fairly recent review of ecosystem services tools by Backstead et al., which you might not be able to see on the screen. We do realize there is many other tools out there, so this may need some updating or extending. But I think for these very well-known and popular tools, these differences are still the case. So why have we developed these tools here at KCL? Well, the idea behind it is that we want to make science accessible. So these so-called policy support systems take into account the data, underlying data, and we deliver the process models, and we deliver the tools to do scenario and policy impact analysis. The models behind it are sophisticated models, though, sophisticated spatial models. And we call this self-parameterizing because we deliver all the tools with all the data you need. Although if you do have better data for a region, you can use your own data. These policy support systems are web-based, so you don't need any capacity to run them. And they come with baselines analysis, and you can do scenario interventions. And so these are analytical tools. So within this policy support system, we have a framework called EcoEngine. That's the framework that we use to develop these policy support systems that can be applied globally. In the framework, there is the database, which is the core really of the system, because it's all about data in the end. So the database is called Simterra, and we currently have more than 500 grids or variables within this database at both these resolutions that the tools run on, so 1 square kilometer, 1 hectare resolution. Some of that data is developed by us, so it's new data, but I would say most of the data is probably data available globally, but is reprocessed and made available by us for these tools. And so a lot of work went into preparing this database. So at the heart of the EcoEngine framework, we have the Simterra database. Then we also have the analytical and visualization tools. As I mentioned earlier, we have the web-based user interface. And the whole system runs in the cloud nowadays. We host it on Amazon servers. So the two tools that we're talking about today are WaterWorld. We currently, I think, version 2.8 or 9. Version 3 is in development. But WaterWorld is a tool that can be used to do detailed process-based modeling of water quantity, but also water quality, but also some ecosystem services, regulation ecosystem services. WaterWorld contains scenario tools for climate change and land use change, and there's also policy option and intervention tools. So you can, for instance, look at impacts of land management. Questing Nature is a somewhat simpler tool, and that can be used to model conservation priorities on the basis of a range of ecosystem services and other factors. So the objectives of WaterWorld, and it's labeled Aqua Andes here, but that's for a tool we've developed for projects in the Andes, but they are the same tools. But the objective from our perspective is that we want to provide a spatially detailed hydrological baseline and the quantitative understanding of likely hydrological outcomes of scenarios. That can be climate change, that can be land use change, and or policy and management interventions. And we want to provide this to you rapidly, cheaply, and in areas where there is little capacity. From your objective, you probably want to use this tool with only a little training, so only maybe an hour or so of training. You want answers quickly. You want it to be available or applicable wherever you are working, to provide for both local scale and national scale analyses. And very important, I think, from a lot of areas that you want it to not require any data. But if you do have data, you can use that. And also, I think important, you want this to be free of charge and require no local technical or software capacity. So some of the scientific principles of WaterWorld, the model is based on an older model called Fiesta, which is an acronym for Fog Interception for the Enhancement of Stream Flow in Tropical Areas, developed by Mark Mulligan and Svi Burke in 2005 for a project in Costa Rica. The model is physically based rather than empirical. We do not calibrate the model, so we don't calibrate it to observe to mimic observed flows because we want it to applicable anywhere in the world. And the model gives you a gridded representation of water balance. So it takes into account wind-driven rainfall. It takes into account fog interception because the model was originally developed as a model to look at the impact of cloud forest on hydrology. And the outgoing flux, obviously, is evapotranspiration. And so in a grid cell, whenever there is a positive water balance, then that will be accumulated downstream. So that will be your flow or runoff. And any changes in climate or land cover or land use impact on the water balance within a cell. And so will have impacts further downstream as well in terms of flow. Some of these processes, of version 1, I should say, of WaterWorld. So this is more the technical backgrounds. As you can see, it uses a lot of data from various sources. I'm not going to go into this too much. If you're really interested in the workings of the model, we have at the user interface, there is all the documentation that you need with all the equations in there. So I'm not going to discuss this here. We're going to use version 2 today, which is similar as version 1, but it also contains a erosion model with which you can model erosion, transportation, sedimentation. It also contains a snow and ice model, very important in certain areas of the world to incorporate that in the water balance. Version 2 also has a water quality module, and what it does is it basically calculates a proxy for water quality, and we call that the human footprint on water. So this water quality module calculates percentage of water at any point that fell as rain on point and non-point potential source of contamination upstream. So for instance, you could have extractives like mines or oil and gas developments upstream, and that will have a potential impact on water quality downstream. And there's also some options in version 2 to do things with supply and demand based on population, and you can implement water treatment and sanitation as well as a scenario. So what do these tools look like? So this slide gives you basically an overview of the initial screen that you'll see when you go to the web page. So we have a Google Maps interface, and at the first step to do any simulation, and this is for both WaterWorld as for Costing Nature, they have a very similar interface actually. But the first thing you need to do is to go to your area of interest. So you can either do that by typing in the location in the location bar, hit go, or you can just drag the map to your area of interest. And then the first step would be to decide your extent of analysis, and that will also define the resolution you will do the analysis on. So we have these big blue tiles, and these are the 10 by 10 degree tiles or grain. So roughly 1,000 by 1,000 kilometers. And if you select that, then the model will be run at 1 kilometer resolution, because they're very large areas. So it's not possible to run these at 1 hectare resolution. However, if your study area is much smaller, then you should run the model at 1 hectare resolution, which is the smaller purple tiles, and that's a 1 degree grain, which is tiles of 100 by 100 kilometers roughly. I will get back to that later when we do the demonstration and show you how you make choice between these two resolutions. So once you've defined your area, and that is nothing more than selecting your area and giving it a name and clicking Define Area, then the next step is to prepare your data. Now, as I said before, all the data that is necessary to run a simulation is available globally. But if you have better data, you can use that. So if you go to step 2 in the system, you click on Prepare Data. What the system will do is it will download or it will copy over all the data from this SimTerra database into your own workspace. So you get some workspace on the server once you create an account on the system, and that's where the simulation will be carried out. And so this could take a few minutes. It copies over all the data. It checks if all the data is there. Sometimes data isn't there, but in that case, there will be a link to build the data. So once the data has been built for your area, you can then go to step 3, which is to start a simulation. So here in the left pane are all your options. So we've defined the area, we've prepared the data. Now we can go to Start Simulation. And all that entails is just clicking on Start Simulation. You will always have to do a baseline simulation before you can do any scenario, because the way it works, with the scenarios, they are used the baseline is used as a comparator for running scenario or policy option alternatives. So in Waterworld, that would take about 50 minutes, depending on the server that you're running it on, and you will have a baseline. And once you have a baseline, you can obviously look at those results first, but then you're also allowed to carry on with step 4, which is the policy exercises, which is the next slide. So as I said before, there is options to do climate change scenarios, land use change scenarios, and there's some others as well, and I will show them to you later. So for the climate change scenarios, we have the full range of IPCC assessment report 4 scenarios in there. So that is between 17 to 21 GCMs, depending on the emission scenario. But you can also create your own scenarios just by changing temperature and percentage of precipitation seasonally, which can also be give you very interesting results, and it's a great way to look at perhaps sensitivity to climate change. So once you've done a run, whether this is a baseline or whether this is a scenario analysis, you can then look at the results, obviously. So the next step would be step 5, which is the results. So once you've done your baseline, if you remember correctly, there were 3 steps, step 1, 2, and 3. And so to look at your results for your baseline, you would skip step 4, which is the policy exercises, and go straight to step 5, is your map results. And the system allows you to visualize the maps on, say, Google Maps. You can overlay them on Google Earth. You can change maps. You can change color scales. You can view maps over other maps, so you can aggregate over other maps. And there's a whole range of other options. And effectively, it acts as a web-based GIS. And there's not many things you can't do here that you would be able to do in a GIS. And so you won't have the need to download the data, but obviously you can download the data if you want to do your own post-processing or keep the results. And we provide them in a variety of GIS formats. So this is examples of the visualization. So on the left, can't click on that, but on the left image you see the baseline water balance for this area by as a pixel based, and then on the right we've averaged that baseline water balance over subcatchments in this case. And so there's a whole range of maps you can average other maps over. You can also mask areas of interest, so you wouldn't see the whole tile but just one basin, for instance. You can also look at the frequency distribution of your map. You can get statistics, etc., etc. So there are 2 more steps to the system. So we've done 1 to 5, but in step 6 you can also look at results over time. So you can look at, for instance, the erosion over time, as in this example, your water balance, your precipitation, because obviously it is a, even though you will get the annual results straight away, but you can also run the model in monthly mode and you will get the monthly results. And then there's also a step 7, which is a narrative of your run, and that's basically a simple text summary of what happened. And it can be very useful to look at first to see what has happened in your run for your baseline or for your scenario. So this is the seasonal outputs that I just mentioned. So you can download seasonal change in hydrological baseline. So for instance, seasonal change in water balance as a result of evapotranspiration and precipitation, or as I said, you can look at soil erosion over time as well, and there's a few others. So the whole system is fully documented online. We have a user guide. We do these demos, but we also do web-based trainings. And the first one that will be next week, or the next one will be next week. And in this documentation, you will find all the background of the model, all the equations, but there's also a tutorial on how to get started. So I suggest if you have problems, look at what's in the documentation and the help first, and that's on the left pane as well. I will show that to you. So in terms of functions, so we have visualization. You can summarize by zone, for instance, administrative regions, important good areas, key biodiversity areas. You can change color scales, you can get statistics, you can do scatter plots of relationships. There's also the option to get a permalink. So we ask you to delete your runs after you're done with them because they take up space on the server, but you can create permalinks to output maps, and they will remain there. So you can embed them on a web page, for instance, or you can send them to colleagues to have a look at. We also allow you to download all the output maps, and there is some options to do analysis as well. You can do sensitivity analysis now, you can look at seasonality, and we can do scatter plots, or you can look at regions of interest as well. So there's a whole range of outputs you get from WaterWorld. Annual maps, obviously, but also if you run it in monthly modes, a number of variables that are outputted monthly as well. And this is a quick summary of the scenarios and interventions. So I already mentioned the climate change one. Land use change, you can do scenarios of afforestation, deforestation. You can change to different land cover types. There is a land use change model in the system now. So what that does is projecting land or deforestation forwards based on historic land use change or deforestation. And then there's a range of land and water management options. We also have scenario options now for extractives. So you can operationalize concessions for mining and oil and gas. And you can always create your own scenarios as well, because we allow you to upload your own maps to the system, although they have to conform to a certain format. So that was a very, very quick overview of Waterworld, but I hope it will become more clear when we go into the demo. The other tool that we'll be demonstrating today is Costing Nature. And the aim of Costing Nature is to map conservation priority anywhere in the world, regionally or locally, on the basis of biological importance, realized ecosystem service provision, current pressures, and future threats. It allows you to map impacts of land use and management interventions or climate change on multiple ecosystem service provision. It deals with multiple ecosystem services, and quite importantly, it distinguishes potential services, so services that are provided but not consumed by humans, from realized service. So for instance, in the Amazon, there will be very high carbon and water services, but those are potential services because there are no direct beneficiaries. And I think that's a very important distinction, and I don't know of any other tools that do this distinction between potential and realized services. All variables are calculated in biophysical units, but then they are indexed globally, so you will get values between 0 and 1. Or you can also index locally, so just for the site that you've chosen to run the analysis on. So what it doesn't do is the valuation of services. That is up to the user. The services that are included are water provision and water quality, carbon storage, carbon sequestration, hazard mitigation, and nature-based tourism. So what does the tool do? For anywhere in the world, it produces a conservation priority baseline using a whole range of data that we provide with the tool. At 2 resolutions, similar to Waterworld, does it at 1 hectare and 1 square kilometer. Costing Nature is focused on ecosystem services, biodiversity metrics, current pressures, future threats. There are tools in there for changing the manner in which services are valued. So you could change a user's value. So it's sort of like implementing a weighting system. So in this case, for instance, you can do a weighting for a measured water surface in a catchment where you have a payment for environmental services scheme, but it doesn't do economic valuation. Similar to Waterworld, there are scenario tools for climate change and land use change, and also similar to Waterworld, because the interface is exactly the same. It allows you to visualize, to do analysis, and to download the output variables. And also similar to Waterworld, you can summarize outputs based on other maps. So for instance, watersheds, admin areas, etc., etc. So a quick summary of some of the outputs. So you get a relative biodiversity index, relative conservation priority index, potential carbon value, potential hazards, potential recreational, potential water provisioning, and then also the realized services. And then there's also the bundled services and the bundled potential and realized services, which are, I think, on the next slides. So when you combine the maps, you will get a map that gives you, in this case, the total ecosystem services combined with nature conservation priorities. And obviously that's very useful information because you can look at pressured and threatened conservation priority areas where there is high potential or high realized service provision. So in this case, somewhere in South America, where we have high values, there is obviously high ecosystem services, high nature conservation priority, so probably not a good site for doing any development, or where there is a very low services or low nature conservation priority might be more suitable. So in a way, this is a very useful tool to do some hotspotting, perhaps. Now, obviously, these tools have their limitations, so we provide some information on where we think you should use tools. You should definitely use the tools when you don't have a baseline or where there's a very poor one. Also, areas where you don't have any data available or limited data available, there's no capacity, etc. These are very useful tools, both water world and costing nature, because we provide them with all the data. If you need a rapid, cheap, but still detailed assessment, and if you have a problem that requires a projection of change, because for both the tools, we give you a baseline, it calculates a baseline first, and then you can apply scenario policy interventions, and they will be compared to the baseline. So you're looking at projection of change factors. The tools are less suitable or shouldn't be used in the case when you need to predict exact current or future magnitudes. So for instance, in water world, it's water world, because we don't calibrate the model, is not the most suitable tool to predict flows or sediment volumes at a dam, for instance. And that's the next point as well. If you need a calibrated model, then there are other tools out there which are better to use. Also, if you have a site that is very small, because we work with the 1 square kilometer, 1 hectare resolution, then it might not make much sense to use these tools, because they are definitely intended for larger scales. So currently we have more than nearly 1,100 users from a whole range of institutions around the world. So we always say to people, just try it out. It's free to get started on the system, and give us your feedback. So that was a very quick overview of these two tools. I'm going to unmute you. Are there any questions at this point, or you want me to get started with the demonstration? And you can either put it in the chat box or talk to me. Okay. I don't see any response. Here we go. One question. Yes, carry on. I'm assuming Radhika is typing now. What kind of hazard mitigation services are included? That's a good question, and if you don't mind, I'll get back to that. But because it basically tells you, and I might be able to show you that now actually, because I've just done a run. So this is jumping the gun a little bit here. No, maybe it hasn't finished running. Oh no, because I haven't finished the run. But basically, we're looking at natural hazards, wildfires, tsunamis, anything that we can get a frequency of whether there's data available. But if you don't mind, I will just do the run first, and then I'll explain a little bit more, and then because the system will tell us what hazard mitigation services are included. Any other questions at this point, or shall I just get started? And if there's any question now, then please just shout or put it in the chat box. So let's start at the beginning. I hope you can all see my screen as well. So to get started with these, oh, here we go. David has a question as well. Go ahead. I'll do that first. Yes, it's possible time frame for the baseline. This is no, you can't change that in the system because we use long-term, for water world we use long-term climatic data, and that data is quite simply just based on roughly 1950, 2000s. But to be honest, I don't think it would make much of a difference, but this might be very site-specific. But the kind of data we use, because we're looking at a baseline for water resources, the longer time period better to some extent. So, short answer, no. Although you would be able to upload your own data, so yes, you could do it. Make a lot of deforestation, yes. But yeah, again, so you would be able to do that analysis by uploading your own data. So yes, technically you can do it, but it's not part of the system, and you will need to do it with your own data. Okay, another question. Does the tools provide specifics? I want to know. The format accepted by the tool is, it depends on the data, but you can think of many scenarios that would say change anything in the land cover. So we provide this with deforestation tools, and you can make them quite specific in the system already. But say you want to do a comparison between a baseline by us and your own deforested area data, then you can, but you will have to upload the maps in a specific format. I think that might become a little bit clearer when I go through the demonstration, because then I can show you how to upload your own data. And once you see how the system works, it probably makes more sense to understand how you could do that. So let me get started. So the first thing you need to do when you want to start this analysis is to go to the main webpage, which is policysupport.org, which you probably know about because you signed up for this demo. Can I ask whoever is chatting, can you please mute when you are talking? And I may have to mute all of you, yes, as Marit just said. I'll do that for now, okay? If you have questions, please type them in. So obviously the first start is to go to the web page. There's all the information here on the trainings, etc. But also in the tabs here you find all these policy support systems that we deliver now. So the first one we're going to look at today is costing nature. So there are a number of different user interfaces. The scientist interface, which is somewhat restricted in terms of the data download, etc., is free and will always be free. However, if you are a very frequent user or you need more heavy analysis, then you can sign up for licensed versions. And there is more information on that on the licensing page. And this is something, this is fairly recent, that we had to introduce a license fee structure in order to maintain the tools. But the scientist interface is still free for all. So on this page you will find some example applications. There is a page that goes to the training pages, and that's actually where I will be going. But if you normally would want to start with the system, you just click on Access PSS here, and this is what it looks like. I'm going to a training server today though, so I'm going to, actually I think I already have it open. I can just go to the main page and switch to another one. Let's log out. So this is what the main page looks like. Today I'm going to be signing in as a Hyperuser because this is a demonstration, and I want to show you all the extra things we have available at a higher user interface. So this is also where, if you haven't used the tools, you can create an account. If you click on Create Account, there's a small pop-up box where you can give us some information. We require you to use an institutional email address, but you can use any other, say, Yahoo, Gmail, etc. address. But then you may have to ask us to release your account, to activate your account. Also, if there's any problems with signing up or creating accounts, then you can email us on the policy support email address. So for now, I'm going to log in as a test account. Log in as Hyperuser. This is where you can change the different user interface. I'm going to be logging in. Now, since we have people today from Madagascar, we've decided to run for the system for the top part of Madagascar today. So it might be more interesting, some of the participants. So the first step, as you can see, I already sort of started moving around. I've logged in now. I can move the map, or I can type in here a location and hit go, and it will center on place somewhere. So the highlighted tile is the tile that is going to be used for the analysis. So if I move the map, then the next one will be highlighted. This tile, the one that's highlighted, will always be the one that is going to be run once you hit define area. If I zoom in more, you will start seeing another grid, and this is the 1 degree or 100 by 100 kilometer grid. So the large grid is the blue grid, which is around roughly 1,000 by 1,000 kilometers. If I zoom in, you see the 100 by 100 kilometer grid, and that's, again, that's the highlighted one, is the one that will be run. So if I zoom out, it's fairly slow. I'm going to run this tile, so I'm going to give it a name, Madagascar. I've already done a run with that name, but it doesn't matter. And then I can set what resolution I want to run this. So if I set it to 1 hectare now, what will happen is it won't run this blue tile, but it will actually run this tile, because that's the one that's highlighted. If I set it back to 1 kilometer, then it will run the blue tile. So step 1 is done. We've given it a name. We've selected our tile, so I can just hit define area. And what you will see at the top now is that the run is set to Madagascar. We are in the baseline currently. This will also tell you what system you're in. You're in Costing Nature version 2.48. You can also see on the left that it's Costing Nature, but you do have to be careful when you use both Waterworld and Costing Nature, because this interface looks exactly the same. So the logo will be different. There might be some other small differences, but it's easy to get confused between the two systems. So it's always good to check whether you are in Costing Nature or Waterworld if you use both tools. So we've now set the run to Madagascar. So the next step is to prepare our data. So I'm just going to click on Prepare Data. And now I have some options here. So I can have a look at all the data. So to do a run in Costing Nature, we need 117 maps. You can see here by all the greens that all this data is available. What that means is that the data is in our database, our Synterra database, but it's not in your workspace. So to get started, we need to copy over all this data into your workspace. There's also option here to define regions of interest and to mask. I won't go into them now. I will show you how that works in Waterworld. So for now, we're just going to run the whole tile. So I can list the workspace data, but what I need to do to get started is to copy the data to my workspace. So I'm just going to workspace. And what the system is doing now is copying over that data from Synterra to your workspace. And if you hover your mouse over these little green bars, you can see what it's doing and where it's at. So we're now unzipping the data. So there's 116 maps to do. This shouldn't take long. Doing a check to ensure consistency. This process might take a little longer in Waterworld because there's more maps in Waterworld to run a simulation. It's a more sophisticated model. But this usually doesn't take more than a few minutes. See, here we go. So now the system tells us that data is ready. So we can have a look at what it looks like. And what you see is that we have a list here of all the data that Costing Nature needs to run. But almost all of them have this little lock sign next to it. And that means that the data is restricted. It means we can use the data in the system. You can use the data for your run, but we're not allowed to show you that data or let you download the data. So some data doesn't have that. So in this case, the mask, which is not very useful. But there might be other maps as well. So in this case, the land cover maps based on modus, you can download and you can have a look at. But usually there's not that many that we are allowed to let you have a look at. However, we do allow you to look at statistics of these maps. So for instance, for the climate change, we have the mean of 17 GCMs. And we can look at some of the statistics by clicking on these tab signs. So I clicked on it. It prepares the statistics, then I hover my mouse over it, and it gives me the minimum, maximum, the sum, count, and the mean. So the mean temperature change to 2050 is based on 17 GCMs for this area is 1.9 degrees. And so this is for us a way to let you interrogate some of the data without actually giving the data to you. And that obviously depends on the licenses, as it says here, with our data providers and your license with us as well. So I'm going to close that now because the data is prepared. It's in our workspace. So the next step then is to start simulation. And that's step 3. So I'll just click on Start Simulation. And now there's options here. So it says currently set to index maps globally rather than locally within the tile. So what that means is that all the output maps that it's going to create are going to be indexed between a value of 0 and 1, but it's going to be done on a global scale. So it's not very likely that we'll hit 1 in any of the output maps, but somewhere in the world there will be a value of 1. But you can, if we would be interested, we can scale it locally just for the area, just for this tile. If I click index locally, all your values will be scaled between 0 and 1 for this particular area. I'm not going to do that now. I'm just going to leave it to global scaling, and I'm going to hit Start. And that's all there is to it to do a baseline simulation. And this is the same process in Waterworld. So now the system will take all that data and run the model, and that shouldn't take too long. Usually only a few minutes. But whilst it's doing that, I can perhaps show you. So some of the help that I mentioned earlier can be found here. So we have our system documentation, and we have our model documentation, as well as a frequently asked questions section here. I finished already, so let's move back. The run is completed, so we can now close this, and we can now look at the outputs. So we've done step 1, define area, step 2, prepare data, and step 3, start simulation. We're now going to skip step 4 because that's the policy exercise, and I'm going to go straight to step 5, which is looking at the results. So this is what the results look like. So we get a list of maps, and it also tells you what it is. So we have the relative aggregate development priority, which is pressured, low conservation priority, and realized service provision. So we should probably start and go through this list. We have the relative conservation priority index, so that's made up of all this data, so EBAs, BirdLife International, the Global 200 ecoregions by WWF, hotspots, last of the wild, important bird areas, key biodiversity areas, and basically it overlays all of the maps, and that creates your overview of important conservation priority areas. Pressures are based on population, wildfire frequency, grazing intensity, agriculture intensity, density of dams, infrastructure, and threats are based on accessibility, proximity to recent deforestation, projected change in population and GDP, projected climate change, and current distribution of nighttime lights. And then finally we have the total potential ecosystem services, so that includes those 4: water, carbon, nature-based tourism, and hazard mitigation. And we have the total realized bundled services, which is the same services, but this is the realized services. So if we have a look at the total realized services for this area, so this is what our viewer looks like. And there's a number of things you can do here. So this is per pixel, the total realized bundled services indexed between 0 and 1 on a global scale. So we don't get a higher value than 0.117. We can look at this in Google Maps. So if I click on the Google Maps icon, it will be overlaid in Google Maps. And you can toggle between overlay and the underlying map, but you can also see that you can already see through the map as well. So you can set the opacity here as well. So that's your Google Maps. You can also look at the maps in Google Earth. We can show you the distribution, which might not be as interesting. But this is for the whole tile, so any of these statistics here and distribution are for the whole tile because we ran the whole tile. But you can mask. We can change the color scale of the map, so we can change it to anything we want, clicking on different color scale. I think blue, green, red is actually good enough. But we can also look at statistics. So this will give us an overview of the statistics in the map. So for all, this is per cell. So all cells, minimum 0, maximum 0.13. The total number of cells, the counts, and the mean value. And for all zeros, non-zeros, positives, negatives, etc. Download the maps can be done here by clicking on download. But you can also, no, not in this case. In Waterworld, you're also able to download them straight from the first results map. We can also look at only positives or only negatives, which is not very useful for costing nature because all values are obviously scaled between 0 and 1. And we can normalize map, but that's already done as well because costing nature already normalizes. But we can also view this map by other maps. If I click on View By, it's preparing a list of maps that can be used to aggregate values over. That could take a little while. There we go. So there's a whole list of maps here that you can use to summarize these pixel-based values. So for instance, we can do it over administrative boundaries. This is your pixel-based values, and I've clicked on local administrative boundaries, so relative total realized bundled service index averaged over local administrative boundaries. And sometimes this is a much better way of presenting or looking at your results by aggregating them over other areas. There's a whole list of maps that you can use to do that. You can also define regions of interest, and again, this interface is exactly the same for Waterworld. So some of the options here might not be as useful for costing nature, but definitely are for Waterworld or vice versa. But you can define zones of interest. So we can define points of interest. So what that will do is it will give you values. So there are no points defined yet, which you can do by defining them. So you can define points individually, or you can upload or copy-paste a points of interest list, and this is just a matter of putting the coordinates in, so latitude, longitude. But you can also look at zones of interest. So if what you can do here, the view by local administrative boundaries or any of those maps, you can also upload your own map with zones of interest. So you can upload your own map and say, give me the values averaged over that particular map. Or you could create a zone of interest yourself. And you can do that by applying certain rules. And this rule applying is, we'll come back to that, because that's a way of defining your own areas in the system. So in this case, we can create a zone of interest based on any of the input data and values. So for instance, I'm going to see if I can find a useful map. Let's try local administrative boundaries again. Or see if the... Okay, maybe this might not work. I get a message that the map's not present. I will show you how this works in another interface then. There might be something to do with how they are loaded. I'm just going to close that now. So let us go back to the Google Map interface. So I'm going to click on View in Google Maps, because there's one more thing you can do here. So obviously, the map we are looking at is the total realized bundled services index, and it says it here as well. The total so this is the bundle of services. So this is water, carbon, hazard mitigation, and nature-based tourism. So combining them, where are they high? But obviously, since they're combined, you can't really tell why we have high values here and why we have low values here. So if you look at this in the Google Earth or the Google Map interface, I can now use this crosshair. So I move the map to get the crosshair on an area that I want to query. And I get the value at that point. So if I click query, this particular value is 0.11 out of a 0.117. So one of the highest values. But if I want to know why this point is scored so high on the total bundled services, I can click on inputs, and then this little icon here comes up. If I click on that, it gives me the map values at that point. So if I click on these show icon, or I can do show all, it tells me at this particular point, the potential carbon value index is 0.39. The nature-based tourism index 0.064. There's hardly any water provisioning, and there's hardly any hazard mitigation ecosystem services. So what this tells me is that the reason why we have high bundled services here is because of carbon. And similarly, we can do this for a low value. So this one is 0.0001. Probably all the values. This hasn't updated yet. Let's see if we can get that refreshed. No. I think I have to click on inputs again. Click this and then check that. There we go. So at that point, obviously all values are really low. So this is a way to get, because we give you these bundled services, we don't give you the individual services as output. This is a way to look at the values at different points and see why you have high values of bundled service or why you have low values. Close that now. So let's look at some of the other maps. So we can look at the, for instance, where do we have high conservation priorities? So again, this is an overlay of EVAs, global tools, ecoregions, hotspots, Leicester Wilds, IBAs, KBAs. And so wherever we have these high values, so this tends to scale to 1, even on a global scale, if there are all these maps or have a region of interest there, then it will scale to 1. So obviously we have 3 distinct regions here in which all score on this overlay of conservation priority. But also here along the coast here, where we had those really high bundled ecosystem services, we obviously also have high values for conservation priority, whereas towards the center here, we don't. So we can then look at one of the other maps. So let's have a look at the pressured with low conservation priority and realized service provision. So I can also pop out this map using this icon. So this is pressured areas with low conservation priority and realized service provision. And then we can also look at pressure and threatened conservation priority areas with high realized service provision. And I'm just going to show them to you next to each other. So high total ecosystem service and nature conservation priority, and total development priority index, and low services. So as we could see from those bundled maps we looked at earlier, obviously we have this region here where we have very high total ecosystem service. So from looking at the nature conservation priority map earlier, we know that there's high conservation priority. So this is the map that combines the two. And this map shows you the total development priority index, which is the, go back to the description of that one, is the pressured, but there's low conservation priority and low realized service. And there's low realized service provision. Okay. Right. So there's a total of, what is it? 1, 2, 4, 5, 10 maps you can have a look at in this user interface for costing nature. So we're currently logged in as Hyperuser. Scientists will give you the same outputs, I think, but there's a super user interface as well, which is one of the licensed ones that will give you some more outputs as well. We can also maybe look at some of the other maps, although I do want to move on to water worlds soon. Look at the threats just quickly. Right, so this is actually quite interesting. So a lot of the threats, and the threats are accessibility, proximity, recent deforestation, projected change in population and GDP, and projected climate change, are all on the other side of the island. And so we saw that we had high ecosystem services here, but the threats seem to occur mostly on the other end. I have to say I haven't run costing nature for this area before, so it's a little bit difficult for me to do this interpretation whilst doing this demonstration. So please bear with me on that. I'm just trying to show you the kind of maps that costing nature will output, as well as how you can look at the results, interrogate them, look at them side by side, etc. But I'll leave the more detailed interpretation up to you. If you're interested, then do the run yourself and look at the outputs. Right, so I'm going to close this now. I'm going to have a quick look at this. So we've done a baseline now in costing nature, and we have had a quick look at some of the outputs. What we can do now is do some of the policy exercises. I'm not going to run them, I'm just show you which policy exercise we have available currently in costing nature. So the way to do that is to click on policy exercises, and then you see, okay, we have priorities and values, we have land use and cover change, and we can change input maps. So look at that one first. So as I said several times now, you can use your own data if you have better data, or you want to do a scenario with your own data. So you can upload individual maps. So if I click on these pluses, this gives you a list of all the maps that the system needs to run. So for instance, you want to run a scenario, or you want to run a scenario of climate change. You want to look at impacts of climate change, although climate change is also used as a threat. But you want to change the data that we use. So we use the 70 model mean for precipitation and temperature. You can change this map by uploading your own map by clicking on this. They do have to conform, your data does have to conform to some characteristics, and they are given to you here. So maps must have these characteristics. They have to be in ArcASCII format, and they have to have these header files, so they have to be rasters, and they must conform to this naming convention. So you will need a little bit of skill to prepare this data, but there is a little guide, I think, on how to do that somewhere in the documentation as well. but you will have to prepare this data in your own GIS if you would wish to change input maps. So some of the other options we have here are the priorities and values. So this is the thing where we can change conservation priorities. So basically, and it gives you an example here as well. So you can increase or decrease the weight for different components on the basis of local priorities. So for instance, carbon, say you have a red project, carbon has a higher priority, then you can change the weighting for the ones that we include. And you can also target that in specific areas. And let's see if we can get this to work. Yes. So this is what I showed earlier with zones of interest, and the rule setting is very similar for other things as well, like masking, which I will show to you later as well. But basically what you can do is you can change these weightings, but you can target where you want by selecting any of those maps and then selecting a particular value on there. So I selected local administrative boundaries. That opened up the map of local administrative boundaries, but they all have a unique ID. Now if I click on viewing Google Maps here, I then get the option to query the unique ID value. So say I'm only interested in putting my weighting for carbon in this area, I click query, and it gives me a value, 19205. I can then copy that and place it in this box. And similarly, I can add other maps, so the one next to it. If I then say equals this, then whatever I do here will only be targeted in these two administrative areas. And I'm just explaining this here, but this rule setting and basically using other maps to identify areas where you want to target something is very similar for other options as well, like setting masks or defining where you want your deforestation to take place, for instance, when you run a deforestation scenario, etc., etc. So if you think of this, there's a whole range of maps here that all have their own specifics. That means you can get very sophisticated targeting, and that's what I meant earlier by it pretty much acts like a GIS, because you have so many other maps that you can use for rule setting. And you can also click on other rules, and you can also then say ignore and. So you can also combine this with another map, for instance. So you can see that the possibilities are pretty much endless. So you could say target above a certain altitude or something like that, or only in a particular sub-basin, only at biodiversity hotspots, etc., etc. Now I'm just showing this here, but this rule setting, as I said, is available elsewhere as well. Now, so this is the option to do prioritization. So we can say, let's increase the weighting of carbon, but we can also do something with valuation. So this changes the values which with different ecosystem services are held. So you can increase or decrease the values attached to specific services across the entire map or in particular parts of the map. And for example, you can increase the value placed on watershed services upstream of dams, right? And the whole thing will be rescaled. So for instance, in this example, when you are looking at a payments for watershed services scheme, you could then increase the value placed on these upstream of dams, for instance. You can change the weight for these 4 services, so carbon, water, hazard, and tourism as well. So that gives you quite a lot of options. And then we also have the option to do scenarios of land use and cover change. And this is exactly the same as in WaterWorld. So I can show it to you here, and then I don't show it to you in WaterWorld. So what we can do is we can change forest cover. So we can replace forest cover with pasture or cropland. So this is deforestation or reforestation, and we can set it to deforest or reforest each pixel by a certain percentage. And we can target that outside protected areas, inside protected areas. And it's pretty much as easy as give it a name, say, I want to deforest, which is minus, everything outside protected areas with 50%. You just do it like this, give it a name, and you do check and submit, and then you'll be able to run a scenario, that scenario. But you can also define your own rule. I'll show you what that looks like. Once it finishes loading. So we can reforest or deforest each pixel for a percentage of land where, and here you see this rule setting comes back, where something on another map, so for instance, a administrative region or a above or below a certain elevation equals a certain value. So you can, for instance, deforest everything above 1,000 meters, in case if you would use the elevation, or you could reforest on slopes or things like that. You can target it protected areas as well, etc. And then you can define. Again, you have the option to do other rules as well, so you can ignore areas. So again, very similar to what I just showed you. And then you can define converted areas as grazing, cropping, protected, or natural. And that will have an impact as well on how much is deforested, reforested. So that's a more specific scenario, because this will just target it at these locations. But if you define your own rule, you can target it more precisely. In a similar way, you can change land cover types. So there are a number of functional types, and I think this is actually more useful for water worlds, where you can do really specific land cover changes that will impact the hydrology, but you can set percentages of tree, herb, and bare soil functional types. So we have 3 functional types of land cover in the data, which is based on MODIS or Landsat, and they are tree, herb, and bare soil. And so you can set the percentages of each of those for every pixel in your area. But you can target, obviously, those pixels, so it could be protected areas or inside or outside or particular elevations. And then you can say, okay, rather than deforesting, reforesting, I want a mix of 60% tree with 30% herb, which is pretty much like crop cover, and 10% bare. And so this gives you even more flexibility in targeting how or where you want to implement your land cover change. Again, you can do this by defining your own rules, so similar to this. And then there's also the option to copy your own maps, upload your own maps, or you can use this land use change model. And the land use change model works by looking at recent changes and projecting those forwards. So continuing recent rate for how many years you want, or multiply recent rate, so you can speed things up as well in a scenario. And you can include current fractional forest degradation rates. You can allocate by agricultural suitability. You can include plant infrastructure if we have that data, or likely new transport routes. And you can target that again using the same methodology as mentioned here. So I think that's quite a lot of information on how you can implement land use and cover change scenarios in both water world and costing nature. But you can see that these scenarios can be very, very detailed and targeted. So the best way to understand and learn how to use them is just by playing around with them. So I'm not going to run a scenario in Costing Nature. In fact, I am actually going to log out of Costing Nature because we have only like half an hour left, and I want to show you Waterworld next. So let's see. This is Waterworld, I think. Yeah. So moving to Waterworld, and as I mentioned before, as you can see, the interface is exactly the same as Costing Nature, but the logo here is different. So make sure you know where you are. Login is Hyperuser. This one has its run done as well. Same tile. I'm going to run the same tile. So I'm going to set it up very similar. We're in Waterworld version 2, so that includes the erosion, the snow and ice, and the water quality module. I'm going to run it for 1 kilometer, and I'm going to click Define Area. And as you can see again at the top, I had this run with a scenario, but now it's changed to a baseline run. Now there's one thing I probably will need to do, and that is to empty out old runs. Let's have a look what runs there are there. Right, so we have a total of 8 runs, but maximum is 7. So I can set up the run, but it won't run. And the way to do that is to go to Manage Simulations here. And so sometimes you'll get a message when you try to start a new simulation, and you get an error message. What you need to do is to clear out your old runs. And this is just good practice. For a scientist interface, I think we allow you 3 runs. After that, the system just won't run anymore, and you will have to clean out your old runs. So the way to do that, both in Costing Nature and Waterworld, is to go to Manage Simulations, and then you can select the resolution. So I know there's not many in my 10-degree tiles, so I'm going to see what kind of runs I have in my 1-degree tiles. And you can see I have 2 runs here. So I'm just going to delete those. And delete that run. Yes. And that gets rid of that particular run. And just freeing up space on the server. I also need to delete the scenario. So go back. Now it's still there, but if I refresh the page, so I can click on refresh, or I can hit F5, it says there are no runs. And now I'm storing 6 out of 7. So we're all good to go. You can also just in one go hit this button, this one. It deletes all runs from all PSS, so it will also delete your Costing Nature runs. But we're good to go for now. So I've just shown you how to get there through Managed Simulations. You can also look at your specific run by clicking on the link here. And then you can see that I'm storing 6 out of 7, and this is the run that I've just defined, Madagascar tile. And it also tells you that it hasn't been run, it's created at this date, and the alternative is baseline. So we haven't done anything, we've just set up this run. I'm now going to click on Prepare Data. And this, so similar to Costing Nature, we can have a look at what maps there are in the Synterra database. So for Waterworld, we have 155 maps, whereas for Costing Nature, we had 117, if you remember. But again, none of these maps are in our workspace, so what we'll have to do is we'll have to copy them over to our workspace. Now, I haven't shown this to you with Costing Nature, but you can actually, rather than running this on tiles, you can mask your area of interest. And this is particularly useful if you're only interested in, say, a particular basin within the area. So let's have a look at what's. So again, this is exactly the same process as we did before. We can look at other maps and then see, okay, so I've clicked on hydrosheds basins. So this is hydrological basins, and you can just pick one particular value like this, query. So say I would only want to run it for this basin, or maybe you want a more coastal basin. You click on this, you select that value, and you say mask it where the map of hydrosheds basins equals this value. And then you can also have the option to ignore. If you then click mask and copy to workspace, now all my simulations will only be done on that sub tile. Again, I'm not going to do that now. I'm just going to copy the full tile because we can actually just look at the outputs, the results, and mask the outputs rather than masking the input data. So I'm just going to copy full tiles. This might take slightly longer than in Costing Nature. So let's have a look at the interface. So as you can see, there's hardly any difference with Costing Nature. So it's always good to check what system you're in. We're in Waterworld version 2. And you can also check the logo here. It also gives you a warning. We are currently signed in as a Hyperuser, so we have some new features. That does sometimes mean there might be some bugs. But we have tried and tested it for this server. Right, that's nearly done, I think. By the way, I have you all still muted, but please do ask questions in the chat box. I am keeping an eye on the chat box, so if you have a question, I know I sort of brushed through Costing Nature and didn't give you any answers maybe to some of your questions you have. So please just tell me if there's anything you'd like to know. Right, that's finished preparing the data. So let's have a look. So again, you see all those little block signs, restricted. We have some data we can look at, but it's wind direction, so it's not very interesting to look at. Study area. Again, it's probably not that interesting to look at some of the data. Maybe this one, that works. So yeah, we can have a look at, for instance, the cover of tree covered ground. So this is fractional tree cover based on Landsat 2000 data. So this is one of these three functional types that I mentioned earlier. So we have, it says Modus here, but it's actually using Landsat. We have bare ground, herb covered ground, and tree covered ground. So this is, we can already see we have very high tree cover here. Much lower around here. So probably that was also the reason why we had these high ecosystem services here based on carbon, because obviously we have lots of trees there. Gives you a citation of the data as well. And as you can see here, you're not allowed to download it because that's licensed, but you are allowed at least to look at it. So I'm going to close this window now, and we're going to set this running. So we've defined our area. We've prepared the data. Let's start a simulation. There's two options here. We can write maps, which means that monthly outputs, but it does take a longer, and it also means there will be more disk space used. So if you don't really need it, then leave it to default, which is not writing maps every time step. So now it will only give us annual results, but that's fine for this demonstration. So I'm going to leave it to that and click on Start. And away we go. Now this probably will take a little bit longer than the Costing Nature run, but it shouldn't take too long. So whilst that's running,
let's go back to the help. So as I mentioned before, we have the documentations here. If I click on system documentation, you'll see that you get a full user guide here. It also tells you something about the licenses and fair use policy, etc. The citation redistribution, definition of terms, very useful to know what to look at, and also tips and troubleshooting, as well as a quick start guide. So you will have access to this once you've created an account. So when you have any questions, I do suggest you look here first and see if this will resolve your problem. It basically tells you step by step how to do an analysis, how to do some of the scenarios and the scenario analysis as well. So here you can see how you can, for instance, do land use, land cover change scenario with some examples as well. So really, before you ask us, then I would recommend you have a look at what's in here. This is the bit about uploading your own map, so it gives you a little bit more information on how to do that, and some about the climate change scenarios as well. So really, this is a good place to start. So that's the documentation on the system. We also have the model documentation here, and that opens up in a new page. And so this gives you the WaterWorld's version 2 modules. So this is actually really brief because this just describes the version 2 modules. But if I click on documentation for version 1, you get the full model documentation. And this includes all the equations, basically the full documentation on how WaterWorld works, with all the submodules, precipitation, how we calculate wind-driven precipitation, fog interception, how evapotranspiration is calculated, how the water balance finally is calculated, etc., etc. So if you really want to know how the model works, and based on what equations, etc., it's all available here. So that would be your first port of call if you have any trouble running it. So I can show you where it is and running. So as I said, WaterWorld takes a little bit longer. Okay, good question. Your example covers 3 different 1 kilometer tiles. How do you reconcile this? Do you always run the simulations separately for each tile? Can you mask the country boundary somehow? No, you will have to do the 3 different tiles. That's simply the way the system is set up in this tile-based approach. So if you're, in this case, you're right, we have 3 different tiles. If I want to know the full water balance for Madagascar, I'll have to run this tile, and this tile. Now, obviously, because this is a water balance model, and you get per pixel value, so it's not really a problem. You can run for each of those tiles, and you can, using a GIS, for instance, stitch them together. You will have some problems if you would, for instance, like to do runoff, because obviously that could cross tiles. Whereas in the current version, the runoff would just end at the edges of the tiles. So the way to go about with that is to do that in your own GIS. And I think that in the system documentation, it actually explains to you how to do that using ArcHydro. I think there is a little, here you go. So conducting hydrological analysis over multiple tiles. There is a little instruction here on how to do that with a free plugin to ArcMap, as there is ArcMap, called ArcHydro. So if you would follow these steps, so you would download the water balance tiles, follow these steps, and you will be able to calculate the runoff over multiple tiles. For everything else that is not flow-based but pixel-based, you can just use the outputs, obviously, from each tile. Okay, yes, I can show again. So that is under the system documentation here in the help. So if I click on that, it opens up a separate page with the user guide, and this bit is all the way at the end. There's also a bit on combining tiles and clipping them in a shapefile using free software called Saga GIS. And also how to create a zone of interest. So when we look at outputs, we can look at, aggregating them over administrative areas, over basins, etc. You remember that whole list. But you can also create your own zones of interest and upload those. So in that case, you would be able to look at water balance averaged over your own zones of interest. And so this little tutorial here tells you how to do that. So that's definitely a little bit more advanced stuff, but we do realize that for some applications it goes across tile boundaries. Although these tiles are pretty big, so for most applications you should be fine by just running the 10-degree tiles. Good. Any other questions? I'll move this back here. One and a half minutes left. So if I would have set this to run monthly, it would probably take about 5 minutes longer. I can see how to run statistics by subcatchment, but I cannot see what a subcatchment file is to view or download. This is possible. Yes, you can view. Yeah, you can view by subcatchment. I'll show you that in the outputs. So basically, when you have the output window, on top of that you have the view by function, and that's where you would select subcatchments. And then you can select which one as well. I hope that is what you are asking about. Okay, I'll show you to you in a minute when we have the results. Right, we're nearly there. There we go. It says we have finished, so we can now close this window. By the way, sometimes it takes a little bit longer to run. You can just close this window, and as it says here, you may close this window. You can even switch off your computer. Once you set it running on the server, it will keep running. There is the very odd case that if a tile has never been run before, it can take up to 24 hours to run a tile because it needs to pre-process solar radiation data, which takes quite a long time. But in that case, you can just close it, you can just switch off, and it will prepare. Right. So we have finished our baseline simulation in Waterworld. We're going to skip step 4 again. We're going to go straight to step 5, results maps. And there's a question there. Since data can be downloaded and used in ArcGIS, can we use it for other purposes, and how do we cite in the publication? There is citation information on all output maps. So, for instance, let's have a look at the water balance, which is obviously the main output for Waterworld. If I click here, There we go. It tells you how to cite. So this is the citation for every model output data, model results from the water world system in commercial use. And obviously there is different citations for the model, and they can be found on the policy support webpage, so the main page of Waterworld in the policy support webpage. So we now have our, let me go first to all the results. So we now have our Waterworld results. So obviously very similar to Costing Nature, but now we have this little all maps icon as well. And what we can see is that these are the key maps. So we have our rainfall, we have our water balance, we have our runoff, erosion maps, and this is the water quality map that I mentioned before. So the mean annual human footprint on water quality, which is the mean percentage of water that may be polluted. The actual evapotranspiration, there is potential evapotranspiration, there is these fog maps, the fog runoff, total fog inputs, and you can download them directly from here in the formats, or you can look at them through the display in GeoBrowse. Now, if I would have done monthly outputs, there would be a set of maps underneath here that link to the monthly outputs. But for now, we're sticking, well, we have the annual results. So let's have a look at the water balance. So you see that it's very similar, or exactly the same actually, as Costing Nature. So we've been through most of this already, but just quickly to resume. So Ravid, you were asking about how to do show results by sub-basin. So that's the view by that I just clicked on. It will now prepare those maps of maps that I can aggregate results over. So there'll be a whole list there. We can already see that we have a very interesting water balance in that we have very high values here along the coast, nearly 3 times as high as the rest of the islands. So if we would, for instance, want to look at it over subcatchments, we have a number of options in Waterworld. Because we can do subcatchments of different sizes. So we can do subcatchments order 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And these are Strahler stream orders. So I'm correct, then the lower the order number, the bigger the subcatchment. So the higher, the smaller the catchment. But there is also the option to look at the subbasins divided by hydrosheds. So if I look at relatively large ones, it might not show, yeah, it does show subcatchments. And then we can look at them. So these are my subcatchments. I think they're very poorly defined actually. Let's try the major basins does here. Okay, so that's fairly limited as well. We have about 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 major hydrosheds basins here. And now we simply have looked at the pixel basis and aggregated them over basins. And again, you can get, so you will get one value now. So I clicked on Google Maps interface. So you get one value per basin. You can get that by querying. So this is 1460, and this is 1440, and this is 90. So definitely this coastal basin, we have a much higher water balance. Subcatchment boundary files available for download to play with them. No. So if I click on any of those, in this interface, you see that the view by, they are not available for download. It's restricted. But you can derive them yourself because they're based on the digital elevation model. So there are some fairly straightforward techniques, and you can use Saga GIS or ArcMap to do that. Upload the digital elevation model data, which is freely available from the USGS website, and you would be able to derive your own catchments. Alternatively, you could just use any zone map. You can upload it, or you can just download the water balance map to your own GIS and then aggregate the values of the water balance over any of your own map. So you could also use your own shapefiles if you have those, for instance. For anything to do with the system, you will have to convert shapefiles to rasters, because we can only deal with rasters in the system. Now, I've shown you the statistics before. There's another function here, it's called threshold by. So what we can do is we can show values in this map are greater than, say, 90%. So show me only top 10% is basically what this does. It's taking a while to load. Right. I don't know what it's doing. Might not be working. I'll leave that running and return to some of the other maps. Yeah, it seems to take a very long time. So, here we go. It does work. So that's what's at more than 90%. So obviously we had those really high values here. And so you can sort of clip out areas of interest. So I set it in this case to look at only the top 10%. But we can also do the mask here. So let's try one of these then. Which one might be interesting? Let's look at, well, let's look at one of sub-basin, for instance. So we have a number of sub-basins. I need to get the value for any one of them. For instance, this one, 395. Close that. And then check and submit. And so what it has done now, rather than aggregating values over other maps, so giving you the mean over something else, we've now masked it. So you will still get pixel-based values, but only for a particular basin. So what I said earlier about before you did the run, you were able to mask, which means that all of the analysis will only be done on that particular mask. But you can also run the whole tile and then mask afterwards. Now, the limitation of that is that you're not able to download this output, whereas if you mask it before you run, you get all the results like that, and you can download those outputs. But it does allow you to only look at those values. So I've only done it for this particular sub-basin. Shown about the maps or the Google Maps output is that you can click on these permalink icons at the top, and that gives you a unique URL that refers to this particular map. So if I would email this URL to someone, they can click on the link and they will go straight to this map. Okay, right, Rafik, I hope this was useful. I think we went through most of it. So thanks for joining. We have a training next week if you're interested. So do sign up, but you might already know that. Okay, right, let's continue. Quickly, so
we looked at some of these maps. I've shown you some of the outputs. There's a couple more things that are interesting. So this icon, the Analyze Map one, is one we haven't done yet. So let's have a look at what that does. I can look at, for instance, I'm looking for it now, for the rainfall. Total annual rainfall. Total wind corrected rain. Let's look at that. If I click on this Analyze Map icon, it gives me the option to plot output maps versus input maps. So I can plot total wind corrected rainfall against, in this case, what might be interesting is elevation. And so I can look at, so what is the impact of elevation on rainfall? So we can see at very high elevations, we have about 1,500 millimeters of rain per year, but it's a pretty much sort of cone-like distribution. But this is a very interesting way of looking at your output results and seeing what other factors impact your results. So this is a very easy way to quickly do some analysis on your data. And as you can see, it also gave me the stats of that map. So for instance, if I look at water balance, I click here, I also get the min, max, mean, sum, and count, which is also given to you when you click on the green icon. So rather than showing you all of those maps, because we're running out of time, I'm going to leave that up to you to have a play with it, run it, and see what the outputs give you. The only thing is left to do, I'm going to show you how to do some of these policy exercises, because we have more of those in Waterworld. So we've now run the baseline. I think I haven't shown you the results, step 6 and 7 though, so let's do that quickly first. So if you remember from the presentation, step 6 is the time series maps. So we can look at water balance, for instance, over time, and you can pop those out, close this, and then look at the water balance next to, for instance, the looking for precipitation. There we go. Pop that out. And here you go. So you have water balance over time, precipitation, and you can obviously straight away see that your water balance is driven by precipitation, which is not surprisingly. And you can also look at some of the other inputs, so or outputs, so your fog, your erosion maps, snowfall, etc. And then finally, step 7, which I haven't showed, is you do narrative. And so this is to tell you what has happened within your run. So I can click on these show icons, and it gives me the values. So water balance for the area was an average 1,400 with 25 percentile of 1,200. So again, if you would run it in masked outputs, you will only get these outputs for your mask. So in that sense, it might be interesting as well to just run, rather than running it for the full tile, to just run it for your area of interest by using the mask option before you start to run. Right, let's close that, and then let's have a look at policy exercises. So as I said, we have a few more in Waterworld than in Costing Nature. So in Costing Nature, we had the land cover, land use change one, and we had climate change and change input maps. In Waterworld, they are very similar. So the climate change, land use change, we also have these land and water management options. So there's a whole range of things you can implement. So you can do things like buffer strips, bench terracing, tanja, dew and hill slopes, and there's a couple of other ones as well that require a different user interface. But basically it allows you to implement a whole range of land and water management options. You can also replace input maps, and I've shown you this in Costing Nature, but it's exactly the same process. You can actually also do this via a server. You are quite technical. And there is
two more interesting ones, but unfortunately I can see they are licensed in this version. I didn't know that. But you can do expand surface mining, expand oil and gas production, and then there's some stuff to do with leaky pipelines, and probably this one is licensed as well, is the change in population. So you can, this one you can run. So you can do a scenario whereby you increase your population. So there is a population modeler in there. So you can do change population by a number of times the projected rate. You can speed that up as well for a number of years, and you can target it again in specific areas as well. You can also do things with internal migration. So as you can see, there is quite a lot of things you can do with this. Let's have a look, because I showed you land use and land cover change in cost to nature. Let's have a quick look then at one of the climate change scenarios. So we have the IPCC models in there. So you can choose. We have only assessment 4 in there at the moment. There's a range of emission scenarios. So let's say A2A. We can choose who has downscaled them. In this case, we look at CIAT, and you can see we have, I think, 21 models here, but you could also run the mean of all models here, or -1 standard deviation, or +1 standard deviation, and that will give you a range of uncertainty in climate change. So you can pick any model that you want. So for instance, choose this, then choose this, hit submit, give it a name, hit submit, and the system will build your scenario. Now, we're running out of time, so I'm not going to do that, but I have run this before. So I can go to Manage Simulations, go to 10-degree tile, and as you can see, I've done a run for Madagascar, same tile, but I've run it with a climate change simulation. Choose that run, close, and as you can see, it's still alternative baseline. It hasn't updated yet. So to see where we are, we need to click on refresh. And now you see we are in Madagascar run, but it has this alternative scenario. So whenever you're not really sure what run you're in, please just hit refresh or hit F5 and it will update. So we can now look at the results of our climate change scenario. And actually, maybe we should have a look at this first. So by clicking on this, it gives me the settings for this scenario. So what I've done is, just like I've shown you, I've done the assessment, 4th assessment report, A to A. I've picked one model, the Max Planck model, for the 2050s. And that has set up, and I can now look at a comparison between the baseline and the scenario. So let's have a quick look at what is the difference between our baseline climate and our scenario climate. So it's running a comparison here. It takes a while because what it's doing is it's generating all those maps for every month and then preparing a comparison for that. Hello. 15 minutes. Right, so I'll let that run. I'm just going to close this. It's all fine. Again, any questions? I see that Radhika needs to leave as well. I think you've seen it all, so, well, almost all. So, yes, sorry, we didn't stick within time, but we had some trouble getting started, as you know. I think we'll be able to finish in 5 minutes for people that are still there. I just want to show you how to do this comparison and how you can look at results for scenario analysis, because there's some minor differences.
Right. Nearly there now. Here we go. So there was a lot of preparation, but I'm only going to show you a few examples. So for instance, we can look at the monthly change in precipitation. So on the left, we have the, I think the baseline, yep. And on the right, we have the alternative. So our mean precipitation for the tile was 350, and it's under this climate change scenario, this GCM, it goes to 360. But what you can also see is that we get all the same options here for looking and interrogating those maps. So you can't download them, but you can look in the display in GeoBrowse, you can look at them in Google Maps, you can create those permalinks, etc. And you will also straight away, by clicking on these, get these statistical distributions of the data. So I always recommend when you set up a scenario to have a look at it rather than just say run, because you need to know what the scenario is that you are running, and particularly if it's a very specific or targeted scenario. This is the place where you do your sense check and see whether your scenario actually makes sense even before you run it. In this case, it seems it makes sense. It's an increase in precipitation is probably what we expect. Might be different. There's actually a decrease here in other months. So there's not that much change, to be honest, in terms of precipitation. We can look at temperature changes here as well. Monthly temperature. I think we should look at these ones. So look at January. This is times 10. So it's 27 degrees from 24. So we have quite a strong increase in temperature for 2050, about 3 degrees here. As well, and I haven't told you this before, but you see that all these numbers are rounded. But if you hover your mouse over it, you get the actual value. So it's 266.8. So it's not really 3 degrees. And this is 24. So it's 24.3 and 26.6. A change in temperature. So that's a way to get the actual values by hovering your mouse over. Right, I'm going to close this now, and I'm going to show you the results, and that's the last thing we're going to do today. So if you run a baseline, what you see is those green icons here. But now, because we've done a scenario, okay, someone else is leaving now as well. Yes, I think you do, Luciano. Thank you very much for joining, and hope you can get started with the system and let us know if you have any feedback on this or any questions. So now instead of those green icons, we get those change icons. So if I look at if I click on this, what it does, it will give you a comparison between the baseline and our scenario. So if I click on the plus here, on the left here we have the baseline output, the annual total water balance. On the right we have the alternative output on the total water balance. And underneath that, we get the difference. And this is the difference in millimeters. So we see that there are quite strong minimum maximum, but overall, actually, you can have a look at that. The changes are not that big. So if I click on query, this is changes in millimeters under the climate change scenario. So we have that place up to 100, nearly 100 millimeters change, 155. But on an overall water balance in the baseline, that is between, well, probably 300-400 to up to 3,000. In some areas, that might not be that big a change. Underneath the millimeter output, we can also get the percentage change from baseline. So this is your percentage change in annual total water balance from the baseline. Again, if I hover over, you can see those values.
So there's one more thing here, that's the sensitivity to change in inputs. I'm not going to do that now, but if you click on that, you will be able to look at what is the change in water balance for any given pixel based on change in other maps. So in this case, because it's a climate change scenario, we have changes in temperature and precipitation for each month. So you will be able to look at a particular area and say, what is the change in this pixel in water balance as per percentage change of temperature in this pixel for January or February. And that gives you some very sophisticated way of looking at your sensitivity to change, which is very useful if you would like to do a sensitivity analysis for a scenario. Right, I think that's all I wanted to say to you. So if you click on the all maps here, you do get the green icons for the alternative map. So if I click on this, it will just give me the output for the climate change scenario. But obviously, if I click on this, then I'll get the two maps, the baseline and the scenario output. And again, you have the options to do this map statistics and to do analyze your map. And this one I have done in monthly outputs. So now I get these monthly list icons. So if I click on those, they will start preparing monthly data. And that's going to take a few minutes, so I'm not going to do that either. But this is the output you will get if by clicking on run in the beginning in your baseline, you set it to monthly outputs, you will get these monthly outputs as well. Right, I think I've said everything I want to say for this demonstration. So thank you very much for joining today. I do hope that you get started with the system. So please create an account if you're interested and start playing around with the system. And also, please let us know if you have any questions or any feedback as well on this demonstration or anything else by replying to the policy support email address. So we have some time for some quick questions if you want, but if not, then thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Indirona, for joining today. Let's see who else we have left. Jenny. Okay, that's fine. Thanks for joining. But yeah, please have a look. I will follow up with an email as well with some of the links in order to get you started. I will send that out today. So if there's no other questions, then I'd like to thank you all very much for joining today, and we hope that you start using the system or that you sign up for one of our training sessions. Thank you very much.